For most of us, castles are Instagram backdrops. Pretty towers, flags in the wind, a nice little gift shop. But the castles in this video were something very different. These were the fortresses that armies feared, that generals avoided, and that sometimes survived for centuries without being taken by force. In this video, travel across Europe, the Middle East, and India to meet 10 of the most powerful castles in history, places that defied Crusaders, Roman legions, Ottoman sultans, and colonial empires. For each one, there will be 3 key questions. Who built it? Who tried to break it? And what made it so terrifying to attack?
By the end, there will be a very different sense of what castle really meant to people who lived and died under these walls.
If there is a final boss of medieval fortifications, it is not a single castle. It is a whole wall system, the defenses of Constantinople. When the Theodosian walls were finished in the 5th century, they wrapped the landward side of the city in 3 lines of defense: a moat, an outer wall, and a huge inner wall studded with dozens of towers. Over the next 1,000 years, everyone came to knock on these gates: Huns, Avars and Persians, Arab armies, Bulgars, Rus, and more. Again and again, chronicles describe attackers getting close, sometimes even breaking outer defenses, and then stalling, crushed by the combination of walls, towers, and defenders who knew every inch of their ground. The city only fell twice, in 1204 to a Crusader fleet that exploited internal chaos, and in 1453 when Mehmed II brought massive gunpowder artillery and a coordinated land and sea attack. Travel west from Constantinople into the hills of Syria, where a Crusader fortress squats on its ridge like a stone battleship. Krak de Chevaliers. Given to the Knights Hospitaller in the 12th century, it was rebuilt into a perfect lesson in castle design, a concentric fortress with an outer wall wrapped around a higher inner stronghold. Enemy forces had to cross open killing fields under arrow fire, then batter through the first ring of walls, then somehow drag siege engines up to attack the second, stronger line. That is one reason even legends like Saladin failed to retake it. The cost in men and time was just too high. In 1271, Mamluk Sultan Baybars did something clever. He used mining and bombardment to capture outer works, then sent what sources describe as a forged letter, claiming the Hospitaller Grand Master had ordered a surrender. The garrison walked out with their lives, but, important detail, even here, the castle was not smashed in a dramatic storm. It was outplayed psychologically after all the usual tactics had failed. Now leave the medieval Levant and jump to the Arabian Sea, where one of the most underrated fortresses in the world rises straight out of the water: Murud-Janjira. From a distance, it looks almost like a ship of stone. Circular walls, about a dozen meters high, with 19 massive bastions, and no easy shoreline to land on. Regional historians describe it as the only fort on India's west coast that was never conquered in battle. The Marathas tried, the Portuguese tried, the Dutch tried, the British tried, and all walked away without managing to crack those sea-washed walls. The trick is the combination of geography and design. Waves act as a permanent moat. The main gate is hidden and only becomes visible at very close range, and the bastions were loaded with artillery that could hit ships before they ever got comfortable. By the time modern states took over, they did it through politics, not a glorious storming of the battlements, which tells everything about how costly an attack would have been. High above the Dead Sea, the plateau of Masada looks like something out of a fantasy movie. Sheer cliffs on all sides, with only a few narrow paths climbing up to the top. Originally fortified by King Herod, Masada became a symbol of stubborn resistance during the First Jewish-Roman War in the 1st century CE. When the Romans finally decided to deal with it, they could not just march up and knock on the door. They had to build a full circumvallation wall at the base, then construct a gigantic siege ramp up one side of the plateau. Ancient sources and archaeology show that only once that enormous earthwork was finished could Roman siege engines get close enough to attack the walls. When the Romans breached the defenses, they found the fortress burned and almost all of the defenders dead in a mass suicide rather than be taken alive. It is a brutal story, but it underlines a simple fact. For months, a professional imperial army could not be sure of victory over a relatively small group because the position itself was that strong. Head north now to the banks of the Nogat River, where Malbork rises like a red brick city within walls. Headquarters of the Teutonic Order, Malbork is often described as the largest brick castle in the world. A complex of outer, middle, and high castles layered behind enormous curtain walls and towers. Its greatest test came after the Battle of Grunwald in 1410, when the Teutonic Knights were decisively beaten in the field by the Polish-Lithuanian alliance. With the army shattered, the victors marched on Malbork, hoping to finish the order by capturing its main fortress. What happened instead has fascinated historians. Despite the enemy victory, and despite being relatively isolated, Malbork held out against siege. The defenders used the multiple wards, the river, and the sheer size of the complex to outlast the besiegers, who finally withdrew. Proving that even after a catastrophic defeat, a truly strong castle could still save an entire state. Over the city of Salzburg, a white-walled fortress sits on its own hill, looking almost decorative to modern tourists. But its record is deadly serious. Hohensalzburg began life in the 11th century and kept being upgraded as weapons improved. By the early modern period, it was one of the largest intact hilltop fortresses in Europe. Official histories of the site put it very plainly: Hohensalzburg was never captured by enemy troops. It faced internal revolts and external threats, but potential attackers looked up at that height, those walls, and the artillery lines, and chose negotiation and surrender over a suicidal assault. Even during the Napoleonic era, the fortress did not fall in a climactic storm. The city capitulated, and the fortress was handed over. Sometimes, the true power of a castle is not measured in how many epic battles it survived, but in how many battles never even started. From alpine cliffs to the gentle hills of a Thames Valley, Windsor Castle may not look as dramatic, but in political terms, it has been one of the most powerful strongholds in Europe. Built soon after the Norman conquest as part of a ring of fortresses around London, Windsor started as a wooden motte and bailey before becoming the massive stone complex seen today. For almost 1,000 years, it has been a working fortress palace, serving as a royal refuge and command center during episodes like the baronial revolts and the English Civil War. Despite all of that turmoil, it was never successfully stormed by an invading foreign army. Its layered defenses and position above the river made it a safe last resort for kings and queens. Unlike many castles on this list, Windsor's power has been as much political as military. Whoever held Windsor usually held the heart of English power. That quiet continuity is its own kind of strength. Travel south to Granada, and you reach a fortress that looks almost too beautiful to be deadly, the Alhambra. Built and expanded by the Nasrid dynasty, it is both palace and fortress, sitting on a ridge above the city, with towers, gates, and walls that control access to the hill. During the last phase of the Reconquista, Granada and the Alhambra became the final stronghold of Muslim rule in Iberia. Christian forces surrounded the kingdom and squeezed it, but rather than launch a ruinous assault on the palace fortress, the Catholic monarchs accepted a negotiated surrender in 1492. So the Alhambra did something unusual. It ended a civilization's story on the peninsula without being dramatically stormed. Its strength, both symbolic and physical, made its fall more about diplomacy and less about everyone dying on the walls. Back in India, the sandstone walls of Mehrangarh rise nearly vertically from a rocky hill above Jodhpur. From the city below, the fort looks like part of the cliff itself, which is exactly the point. Built and expanded by the Rathore rulers, Mehrangarh is guarded by a series of tortuous angled gateways. Each turn forces attackers into narrow spaces overlooked by defenders who could fire arrows, drop stones, or, later, use firearms. Local histories describe it as one of the mightiest hill forts of Rajasthan, enduring sieges and bombardment with minimal damage to its core defenses. Even when the political situation changed with the arrival of the British, it was influence and treaties that reshaped its role, not a heroic assault up those impossible slopes. As with many on this list, the best proof of its power is simply how rarely anyone chose to test it seriously. Into North Wales, looking at something almost too perfect: Beaumaris Castle. It was part of King Edward I's iron ring of fortresses built to hold Wales, and was designed as a textbook concentric castle. Outer walls with towers, then higher inner walls, all wrapped around a broad moat fed from the sea. Military historians often call it one of the most technically perfect examples of medieval castle design ever attempted. Ironically, money and time ran short, and the castle was never completely finished, and it was never really tested by a full-scale medieval siege at the height of its potential. But on paper, and in stone, Beaumaris shows how far European engineers were able to push the idea of a defensive fortress before gunpowder artillery changed the rules completely. If Krak de Chevaliers is the Crusader masterpiece, Beaumaris is the late medieval engineering thesis on how to make storming a castle basically impossible. Looking across these 10 sites, from sea forts and desert plateaus to royal palaces and hilltop citadels, one pattern keeps appearing. The best castles win by making battle pointless. Sometimes that meant attackers wasted months and went home. Sometimes it meant they negotiated. Sometimes, as at Masada or Constantinople in 1453, technology or tragedy finally tipped the balance. But in every case, these fortresses shaped the map around them. They protected capitals, controlled trade routes, shielded dynasties, and sometimes became symbols powerful enough to outlive the wars themselves. Today, they are tourist sites, documentary backdrops, and, for channels like this, incredible windows into how people actually fought and survived in the past.